He's written 18 environmental justice books. Quite a lot, huh? Including Dumping in Dixie and Invisible Houston, which is for sale outside if you're interested. Also, his work has earned him a recent award from the Sierra Club. And the summit that we're doing today is really focused on his first book, Invisible Houston, that was written in 1987. And so we're now coming back 30 years later and revisiting some of those issues that he found at that point in time. And so he's going to present to us today. The title of his presentation is Environmental Justice, Challenges and Opportunities in Houston. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Bullard?
Thank you very much. Good morning. Okay, this paper presentation is co-authored by two of my colleagues, Dr. Glenn Johnson and Dr. Danae King, who you just heard from. Environmental justice challenges and opportunities in Houston. What is the environment? The environment is everything. It's where we live, work, play, learn, as well as the physical and natural world. So when we're looking at environmental justice, we're going to be looking at the physical environment, neighborhoods, playgrounds, workplace, as well as wetlands, etc. And if you look at the principle of environmental justice, it said it embraces the idea that all communities have an equal right to environmental protection, education, housing, transportation, civil rights, etc. Houston is in the South, even though some people say, oh, we're Southwestern. No, we're Southern. The South has a long legacy of being stuck with, as we heard this morning, a legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and resistance to equal justice, including environmental justice. The South is also the most environmentally befouled region of the country, and it's not by accident. There is a direct correlation between exploitation of land and exploitation of people. We know that healthy people and healthy places are correlated. One of the most potent predictors of health is zip code, and we can go even further than zip code, census tract for the geographers. And so the poorest people within the United States also have the worst health and the most degraded environments. Houston, no exception. My first job out of graduate school in 1976, I found myself 2 years out of graduate school in Houston as a sociologist at this university. And I was asked to collect data for a lawsuit that was filed by Linda McKeever Bullard, my wife at the time. And she's a lawyer, and she needed someone to collect data for a lawsuit, and I got drafted. She sued the state of Texas, my employer. First lawsuit to challenge environmental discrimination was Sabine versus Southwestern Management. I did the study in 1979. I had 10 graduate students in my research methods class in Hannah Hall, across the way, and we collected the first study on Houston and solid waste sites and discrimination. Groundbreaking study. The gentleman that you see here is Al Green, Justice of the Peace, out there protesting. Now he's a U.S. congressman from Houston. Things have changed. If you look at this whole question of Invisible Houston, I was doing that study, and I expanded that study, and one of the chapters in the book, Invisible Houston, deals with the Bean case and dumping in Houston and discrimination, environmental discrimination. When we did this study, all five of Houston city-owned landfills were located in black neighborhoods. All five out of five. 6 out of 8 of the city-owned incinerators were located in black neighborhoods. 3 out of 4 of the privately owned landfills were located in black neighborhoods. 80% 82% of all the garbage disposed in Houston from 1920s up until 1978, when that lawsuit was filed, was located in black neighborhoods. 82% of all the garbage went to black neighborhoods. Now, I've traveled all over this country. I've never seen 82% of anything good, libraries, good schools, in black neighborhoods. We always get all the things that other people don't want. And for planners, and I'm the dean of a school that has a master's and a PhD program in urban planning, we call those locally unwanted land uses, LULUs. All the LULUs are disproportionately located in our neighborhoods. Here's a map, a chart that shows you where the landfills and incinerators are, and there are certain council districts that get most of the things that other people don't want. You ever heard of District B? You heard of District D? Landfills. One of the first disputes that first black city council member in Houston had to deal with was a landfill, Kirkpatrick's Dump, located up in Cashmere Garden. No, I'm sorry, Trinity Garden. If you look at the privately-owned landfills in Houston from the 70s, 1978, when the lawsuit was filed, you can see that all landfills located in communities of color. There are 2 landfills right now that accept solid waste in Houston. 100% of all the garbage in Houston right now, 2013, goes to landfills located in black neighborhoods. And they're all 2 of them are located in District B, McCarty Landfill and Whispering Pines. Type 1 landfills, even when Houston sends its waste out of the city, it shifts it to communities of color. Illegal dumping. In 1978, when we were doing this study, 1979, illegal dumping was a big problem in 1979. I come back to Houston 25 years, fast forward future, first thing I get calls from city councilmen, can you help us with what? Illegal dumping. I said, damn, I dealt with that 25 years ago. You still got it? They still illegally dump. They know where the areas are. Once an area is identified with unofficially zoned for illegally dumping, Houston doesn't have zoning, but it has what's called, it has unofficially zoning. And we know where they are. If you look at the fact that we were able to retrieve data from the city solid waste department, 311 calls. These are calls where people are calling and say, there's an illegal, people have pushed stuff out the back of the truck, there's illegal dump over here. We got data from 2008 to 2011. There were 18,000 calls, 18,367. And we did a map of them and tracked them. District B, D, and H seem to be the hot spots. Places that are so compatible with illegal dumping. 59% of all the calls in 2008 was and 66% calls from 2008 to 2011. This is a map of all the calls, and you can see certain areas geographically. There are not very many calls, and there's not very many illegal dumping. I mean, there's something about, if you have a landfill in your neighborhood, and historically you've had landfills over the period of time, landfills attract garbage. We don't know why, scientifically. But this is a map of the illegal dumping, and you can see the dark areas represent the hot spots. It also represents dark areas represent where we live. If you talk about the fact that toxic waste and race in the United States, we did a study in 1987. United Church of Christ did a study in 1987, national study, found that race was the most potent variable to predict where hazardous waste facilities are located. Not income, not property values, not whether or not you had a PhD or whatever, but race. Race. And in 1987, about a third of the residents living within a 2-mile radius of a commercial hazardous waste facility were people of color. About 1/3. That's about 34%. We updated that study in 2007, and what we found is that thing has gotten worse. Nationally, 56% of all the residents living around 2-mile radius of a commercial hazardous waste facility were people of color. When you add the clustering effect, 2 or more facilities, that number jumped to 70%. Well, what about toxic waste and race in Houston? What does it look like? 2007, Houston actually was number 3 on the list of having the number of commercial hazardous waste facilities. LA was first with 17, and Detroit was 12, was second, and Houston came in third with 10. However, Houston had the second highest percentage of minority residents living within a 2-mile radius of a facility. Almost 79% of the residents who live within a 2-mile radius of these hazardous waste facilities were people of color, African Americans and Latinos. In 2013, look at the numbers. 82% of the residents who live within a 2-mile radius of a commercial hazardous waste facility in Houston were people of color. 82%. That's 8 out of every 10 person that lives within 2 miles of these hazardous facilities were people of color. And the vast majority of residents, that is from 74% to 97% of the residents who live within these 2-mile radius, in 6 of the 7 facilities, you had this high concentration, this hyper-segregated neighborhoods that hosted these facilities. This map washes out a bit, but the red area, the dark area, represent where most of these facilities are located. The dark areas, mostly African American and Latino. If you look at the facilities, there were 4 facilities in District I, the chosen district for these commercial hazardous waste facilities. So all of the toxic waste is not randomly distributed, and it's not equally distributed. It's not equally shared. So when we talk about polluting facilities as neighbors, there are other ways you can look at it, not just hazardous waste facilities. There are other facilities, toxic release inventory reporting facilities. These are facilities that produce chemicals, and they're so dangerous that they have to report to the federal EPA. And looking at the pattern in Houston, in 1990 there were 124 of these facilities. In 2000 there were 126 of them, and in 2011 there were 85. You can see the number of pounds going down from 10 million pounds to, in 2011, there's 1.4 million pounds. The pounds are getting better in terms of the releases, but in terms of the location, there's a pattern that is disturbing in that even when things are getting better, they're getting better for some people, but not for others, as we see. The share of facilities located in heavily minority areas, that is, heavily minority, we're talking about hyper-segregated, these are areas where greater than 75% minority, has not changed much over the years. In 1990, 79% of the residents who live within a 2-mile radius of these facilities were people of color. In the year 2000 and 2011, it was 80%. So there's been a steady fact that these facilities remain polluting people of color. However, the share of releases, even you got a fewer number of facilities, the share of releases actually changed, and not in the right direction either. The share of releases in heavily minority areas increased over the 3 reporting periods. In 90% in 1990, 95% in 2000, and 94%. In other words, in 1990, 90% of the releases were in people of color communities. In 2000, it went up to 95%. And in 2011 data shows that it's 94%. 94% of the toxic releases in Houston are in those heavy communities of color neighborhoods. And this is a chart showing you graphically what happened from 1990 to 2011 in terms of the releases as well as the facilities. Here's a chart showing you the dots. The dots, it means bad. You don't want a dot. But the dots are heavily concentrated in the red areas, the dark shaded areas. And if you would, the heavy shaded areas are correlated. This is 1990, correlated with high concentration of people of color. This is 2000. The same pattern holds true in terms of where the dots are. The dots are in the red, not good. And this is 2011, very similar pattern. It's hard to see on this on this map, but that's the pattern in terms of where the facilities are. We actually did a calculation of the 10 most polluted zip code and the 10 most polluted census tract. We reported the 10 most polluted census tracts. In other words, if you go all the way down and say a census tract, we say that's a neighborhood, the most polluted. You know, Houston likes to brag about we're the number one when it comes to job creation. We're number one when it comes to, okay, now we say, well, okay, which city census tracts are number one when it comes to pollution? Nothing to brag about, but something to be concerned about. Again, if you look at the most polluted, we're talking about census tracts where, in the case of the top 10, look at all of them, the vast majority of them are heavily populated by people of color. The top 10 most polluted. And there are concentrations, for example, in and we know where they are. I mean, this is not rocket science, it's not smoke and mirrors, it's not magic. We know where they are geographically. You know, we're talking the Ship Channel, we're talking industrial, we're talking high concentration, but we're talking neighborhoods adjacent to fence line and on the front line. So if we talk about how do we create just and sustainable communities, we have to address the fact that Houston is unlikely to become a sustainable community until it addresses the issue of justice and equity, fairness, and the legacy issues. Houston is becoming a greener city. It is becoming greener. But what about those invisible neighborhoods? What about invisible Houston that has all of this pollution? You can dress it up, put a bow around it, and perfume spray what it is. It's still a dump, a garbage facility, a sanitary landfill. Sounds good, but there is nothing sanitary about a landfill. Polluting facilities adjacent to and your neighbor, fences do not make good neighbors if you live next to a polluting facility. Pollution doesn't stop at the fence line. And so we have to address these hot spots. And with GIS and with research, we can show you where the hot spots are, and that's where the targeted enforcement needs to occur. Sustainability must address equity and of overburdened communities, communities that have borne the brunt of this city's industrial growth and wealth, and that wealth has been gained on the backs, but not just the backs part of the anatomy, the lungs, the breathing apparatuses of people who live closest to and near these toxic facilities. And so this whole idea of how do we create opportunity out of these challenges, it means that coming together, bringing the research scientists, working with communities that are on the fence line, not telling them what they need, not leading them, but working with them, providing resources for them in support of their movements, in support of their goals and opportunities, help build their organizations and support them, having our students work with them. Students they can get a grade, but they get more than a grade. They get information and they gain knowledge and sensitivity about what's happening to their communities. This is very important, and I thank you very much.
Next we'll have Dr. Elena Kraft of the Environmental Defense Fund, and she's also an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Texas School of Public Health. Her expertise is in air toxics, and she has been focused really on the port area in the Houston area and in the southeast and other EJ communities. And as we saw in Dr. Bullard's presentation, that port area is District I, and we saw District I quite a bit. Dr. Kraft also serves on the EPA's Environmental Justice Technical Review Panel, and her presentation today will address pollution hotspots around the ports. Join me in welcoming Dr. Kraft.
First of all, it's a true honor to be here. It's amazing what Dean Bullard and the folks at Texas Southern University have done at this school, and how his return to Houston has brought renewed energy and vigor to these environmental justice challenges. And it's terrific, so thank you so much. I wanted to talk a few minutes today about some of the specific EJ concerns that we have around the transportation sector. And I don't think that anyone here needs to be told that folks that live near freight corridors or networks like ports or inland rail facilities are exposed to higher concentrations of air pollution. I think that's a given. The type of pollution I'll be talking about today is primarily coming from diesel engines. So these are the engines that power most of the transportation sector. You've got diesel engines in the ships, diesel engines in the trucks, diesel engines running that cargo handling equipment. And the primary health threat from my perspective is particulate matter. It's that very fine soot. When you breathe it in, it gets into the very smallest spaces of your lungs called the alveoli. It can actually enter your bloodstream. And the World Health Organization just this year classified particulate matter and air pollution in general as a known human carcinogen. So we know that particulate matter causes cancer. A subset of particulate matter is called black carbon. Black carbon is the most light-absorbing portion of that particulate matter and has been implicated as an important contributor to climate change and to warming of the atmosphere. We've also got nitrogen oxides. Nitrogen oxides are one of those pollutants that helps to create ozone. Ozone can lead to cardiorespiratory problems, leads to asthma attacks. African Americans have the highest rate of asthma as a demographic group in this country. And then, of course, other toxics like benzene, butadiene, formaldehyde, other carcinogens that are all part of that suite of compounds that are mixed together as part of the combustion process from those diesel engines. And looking at this map, these are counties that highlight, in the United States, that highlight where the ozone standard is exceeded, where the majority of scientists believe that ozone is too high, that it is not protective of public health. And you can see that we're covering quite a large percentage of the country. And in many of the areas where you don't see anything, in likelihood that might be because there's not a monitor there. And it's no surprise that many of these areas are around ports and other hotspots. So this map overlays where there are different counties that exceed the federal health-based standard for particulate matter as well as for ozone, so kind of a double whammy area. And you can see where most of those areas are located along the coast, along areas where you would see high population centers. But how do you distinguish between the different socioeconomic indicators and the impact to human health? So for instance, we know that education is correlated with health. Those who are less educated tend to be not as healthy. So how do you make that case that when everyone's trying to pin the problem on another industry or education or access to healthcare, how do you get those industries to clean up, to take responsibility for the pollution that they're putting out into the atmosphere that we're all breathing? It's hard. And so one of the tools that I wanted to point out, which is just become available, is a tool called EJ Screen, which is meant to help identify areas that may be at increased risk for health impacts as a result of environmental exposures and other factors affecting susceptibility to disease. So all of those statistics that Dr. Bullard showed, the TRI releases, this data set has Superfund sites, it has metal recycling facilities, all kinds of information that has been collected on a national scale and can be used to generate these maps with this information overlaid. So if you add too many things, it gets to be really complicated, but what I wanted to just show is the cancer risk in the Houston area and where we see the highest cancer risk. And you can see that it's not equally distributed. I'll point that out. And so we need to understand why is that. And these tools are helpful because they're going to be able to help us use those data that are out there to understand what kinds of facilities are there, what kinds of landfills are there, what kinds of other risk factors exist that are creating these inequities in terms of the health disparity that we see. So I want to just mention that there have been a number of reports. I mentioned the World Health Organization. We know that kids with autism are 2 to 3 times more likely than other children to have been exposed to air pollution during their earliest days. This could be a factor in the rising cases of autism that we're seeing across the country. We know that in Houston, some researchers at Rice, Lauren Rahn, and found that a moderate increase in either particulate matter or ozone could increase your risk of a heart attack by close to 5%. What does that mean? It means that we need to do a better job of understanding where this pollution exists and how we can marshal resources to be there where we need the resources and where we see those health impacts. And what we don't want to see is having to go to those communities that are more heavily impacted, like those communities with this lower socioeconomic status. I mentioned transportation and ports, but why are we calling out this particular sector? One reason is that emissions from freight transportation are the fastest growing emissions within the transportation sector as a whole. So this is one of those problems that is not getting better, it's getting worse. We move over 90 million tons of freight in the United States. We're expected to move over 90 million by the year 2020. That's a 70% increase in just over a decade, and it's double the rate of vehicle emissions from passenger vehicles. One factor that's contributing to this anticipated growth within the transportation sector is the expansion of the Panama Canal. It's expected to open in 2015. There are various estimates on the impact of opening this Panama Canal, but let's suffice it to say that the major ports on the Gulf Coast, including Houston, as well as many ports on the East Coast, are undergoing these enormous expansion projects. Houston, $20 million in operating revenue in May. This was the highest in port history. Total tonnage is up 9% this year. Miami, investing more than $2 billion in port infrastructure. 6 new cruise ships making their way there every week. So we've got to do something about that, and we've got to make sure that the communities that are living around these port areas, as we saw with Dr. Bullard's presentation, these are the areas that we're concerned about. It's not just landfills, it's not just toxic release sites. Areas like ports where they're held up as the economic engines of the region. These are areas where we've got to say, look, something needs to be done. What are the different sources? Rail, ships, cargo handling equipment, trucks, harbor craft. And what can be done? Well, one of the things that's happened over the years is that EPA has strengthened some of those engine standards for the diesel equipment. The problem is that while many of those long-haul trucks, the trucks that are moving East Coast to West Coast, have transitioned to that newer equipment, the older equipment, the more polluting equipment, is sitting around at the port, driving 2 or 4 miles every day, 3,000 trucks a day at the Port of Houston. And I want to show what a good policy can do for transportation. This is a graph of the emission control area impact. So what the emission control area is, the International Maritime Organization made a requirement that if a ship is operating within 200 nautical miles of the shoreline, it has to burn cleaner fuel. What that means is that the particulate matter coming from those ships is going to be reduced by 2 to 4 micrograms per meter cubed. That doesn't sound like a lot, but Houston is likely to be out of attainment with particulate matter by 1 microgram. So a 2 microgram savings, if you will keep the area in attainment with federal guidelines. So it's just to show you what a good policy can do. And I want to just show some of the things that are good that are going on at ports. Some ports are putting together clean truck programs. They're turning over those 3,000 trucks that they have. California implemented a ban in the ports of LA and ports of Long Beach. You cannot do business at the port if your truck is older than 2007. Some ports are requiring shore power. Instead of having the ships burn that dirty bunker fuel, they're required to plug into the grid. And then some ports are being even more aggressive. They're putting in renewable energy at the ports to power their operations. And then one thing that I wanted to mention that we're doing is that we want to highlight what those ports are that are doing good things, or what they're out there doing, and we want to pressure the ports that haven't taken any action to start doing something. Because when you look at the emissions from ports overall, you're talking about an inventory that's equivalent to a small power plant. You can think about the number of controls that are required for a power plant. You think about the controls that are required for a port, 0. So something has to be done to address that discrepancy. And then at the same time, EPA, they're participating in our effort to help recognize those top environmental performers, but they're also hosting their own series of national conversations on ports. They want to know what communities want from the ports. And so I encourage everyone here that if you live near the port area, if you're concerned about pollution from ports, please make your voice known, because that's one of the ways that EPA can generate change, is that if they have that feedback from the public. And I want to end with a story that I heard recently on StoryCorps, and you may have heard about StoryCorps on NPR. But for those of you who don't know it, it's a national storytelling project. They've conducted tens of thousands of interviews, and each story is housed at the Library of Congress. And this one particular story struck me, and I keep thinking about how it relates to my own work. In the summer of 1959, a 9-year-old black boy in Lake City, South Carolina, refused to leave the library without being allowed to check out his books. The librarian told him, "You're a colored, you're not allowed to check out these books. I'm going to call the police." And so he said, "Well, okay, I'll wait." So after some time, the police arrive, and his mom arrives, and the policeman was kind of like, "What are we doing here? We can spend our time doing better things." And so the policeman said to the librarian, "Why don't you just give the kid his books?" And his mom said, he'll take good care of them." And so the librarian reluctantly gave the child the books, and as he left, he said, "Thank you, ma'am." And it turns out that kid was astronaut Ron McNair. And he went on to become the valedictorian of his high school, and he got his PhD at MIT. Unfortunately, he died on his second space mission when the shuttle Challenger crashed. And what struck me about this story is not the story itself, but the story was told by Ron's brother, Carl. And what he said was, Ron was the one who didn't accept societal norms as being his norm. That was for other people. And so I want to leave you with that thought, that just because something seems like it is a norm, why do some areas in the richest nation in the world look like a third world country? That doesn't mean it's supposed to be that way. And so for each of us here, we have the power to influence that change. And in fact, it is the only thing that's going to influence that change. So thank you.
Our next speaker will be Mr. Adrian Shelley. Mr. Shelley received his law degree from the UT School of Law, and as an environmental lawyer has focused on the field of clean air litigation. He served as the environmental director and counsel for State Representative Jessica Farrar during the 82nd session of the Texas Legislature. And he will present today on environmental justice in port communities as well. Welcome me. Join me in welcoming Mr. Shelley. This advances, that's your corner.
All right.
Right?
All right, thank you, Danae, and I want to thank our host today. It's a real honor to be here and to share the stage with some real visionaries on this subject. So there are 13 deep water ports in the Texas Gulf Coast. All of them share a range of issues related to goods movement, and of course here in Texas related to the energy and petrochemical industry. And there's an underlying and indeed underlined issue in all of these ports, and that is the issue of environmental justice. As Dr. Kraft mentioned, the Port of Houston is undergoing an unprecedented expansion. It is related to the expansion of the Panama Canal. And the Port of Houston also underwent sunset review before the Texas Legislature this year. There was not initially a sunset process built into the Port of Houston Authority, but over the years it had become increasingly deaf to the concerns of residents in and around port communities. There were issues about secret meetings, financial improprieties, and a variety of issues that eventually led the legislature to bring the Port of Houston Authority under sunset review. And as that happened, there was an organization, the Healthy Port Communities Coalition, that sprang up to take advantage of the port undergoing that review. And I'll talk about that organization in a minute, but can't see the bars here too well, but this is the last emissions inventory that was done by the Port of Houston Authority. It was done in 2007, and we can see very large emissions coming out of the port, and the largest component of that, as Dr. Kraft pointed out, is the ocean-going vessels. Now, we often hear that the Houston metropolitan area is one of the most heavily monitored areas in the world. And that is true, but looking at a map here of the ship channel itself, we can see that there's a real lack of air monitoring in the area. And indeed, there is no way to put enough air monitors in the area to truly understand the complex and huge emissions that we see in this area. Dr. Kraft mentioned particulate matter, and air toxics are two pollutants that tend to be concentrated in hotspots. One pollutant that's thought of as being generally more widely dispersed is ozone. And that is often true, but there are occasions in which ozone pollution is centered around emissions, large emissions of volatile organic compounds. And when those events occur, they invariably occur around the Houston Ship Channel. And I just want to show you an example of that. If you take a look at that monitor right there, we can see an ozone, oh, you know what, it was that monitor. We can see an ozone event that occurred in January of this year. This was January 21st, 2013. Ozone season in Houston is March through November, right? It's not common at all to see an ozone event in January, and some of you are nodding your heads, right? This is an event that was the direct result of a large emissions event around the Port of Houston, and you can see that the effect in this area right here directly impacts our port communities. So I mentioned earlier a coalition that was formed a little bit more than a year ago, the Healthy Port Communities Coalition. It is a group of half a dozen environmental and public health advocacy organizations, most of them based right here in Houston, one of them in Austin. And this coalition conducted a community survey over the last several months of the year in port communities. There were 378 Ship Channel residents that were surveyed. Survey respondents were 85% people of color, which is roughly what we see in the zip codes around the Port of Houston. And for that matter, it's not indicated here, but in the 7 zip codes surrounding the Port of Houston, there are higher poverty rates in addition to higher percentages of minorities. The average income in those 7 zip codes is about $31,000 compared to an average income in Houston of $42,000. The 5 communities that were surveyed over here on the right-hand side: Denver Harbor, Pasadena, Fifth Ward, East End, and Manchester. The survey focused on 4 major areas: health, employment, pollution, and community needs. Starting with some health results, we've already heard this several times today. We found, amongst our survey respondents, what is already known. There are elevated rates of respiratory illness and cancer in these communities. Among our respondents, there was a 27% incidence of cancer and other respiratory diseases versus about 12% for the rest of Texas. Cancer rates, you're about 50% more likely, according to our survey, to suffer from cancer. About 5.6% of respondents versus 3.7% in Texas. In addition to that, we all know that there is the highest percentage of uninsured residents here in Texas of any state in the Union. That problem is even greater here in our port communities. Over half of respondents do not have health care coverage. Access to health care is also poor in these communities. We surveyed about 5 communities, and you can see right here, 17.42% of them are going to the Strawberry Health Clinic. That is a low-income health clinic that is maintained by Harris County. It is the only low-income health clinic in a half-dozen communities around the Ship Channel. Respondents told us stories about waiting for months in order to get an appointment at one of these health clinics. And God help you if you need a referral for a specialist. You're looking at several months to see a GP in order to get that referral, another several months before you can see your specialist. There are a couple of they're not indicated in here, but there were respondents who were traveling to Mexico for health care. There were respondents who were using Google to learn as much as they could about their health problems because they simply did not have access to low-income health care. Employment. There's an overwhelming need for employment opportunities in these communities. 40%, you can't see the number in there, but it's about 40% of households had an unemployed resident. The Houston rate of employment is lower than the national average. Houston rate is 6.1% of individuals. 40% of households in our survey had an unemployed resident. There's overwhelming perception that there are not enough employment opportunities in these communities. 70% of respondents cited a lack of employment opportunities and a lack of job training. 61% of respondents said there were more opportunities for job training needed in their communities. Dr. Graff mentioned that phrase that we hear often, economic engine. The Port of Houston is supposed to be the economic engine of Houston and of Texas. It is not an economic engine in the households that it borders. There's an overwhelming request for job training in these communities. Something like 80% of residents asked for job training opportunities. We would like local industries to invest in their neighbors. We need job training, we need educational opportunities so that local residents can take advantage of those highly skilled and long-term jobs that are available with this expansion. Pollution, of course, we already know is a major concern in these communities. 76% of people are concerned about the 18-wheelers they see in their communities. Some of these roads see thousands of trucks every single day. They present immediate safety risks and long-term health risks. There's also a huge concern about pollution from train and rail yards. Pipe yards, refineries, chemical plants, fully 83% of respondents were concerned about the impacts of these sources on their health and well-being. And finally, community needs. Overwhelming responses here. More than 90%, and in some cases more than 95% of respondents expressed a need for opportunities, health clinics, jobs, job training, and community oversight to reduce pollution. One thing that needs to be pointed out here, there's a great deal of optimism in these communities about the expansion. More than 80% of respondents believed that the expansion at the Port of Houston would benefit their communities and their lives. There are a lot of kind of stark messages here today. There were some stark messages in our survey and in our respondents, but the overwhelming theme is one of optimism. We have an opportunity here for the expansion at the Port of Houston to benefit these communities and the lives of the individuals in them. Our recommendations for the Port of Houston Authority: number one, the authority needs to serve as a leader in this region. You often hear the Port of Houston Authority claim responsibility for 1 million jobs in the Houston region. 1 million jobs. When you ask the Port of Houston Authority, what responsibility are you taking for the pollution in these communities, they will say, well, the Port of Houston Authority is only responsible for 15% of the cargo that comes in and out of the Port of Houston. They don't say we're responsible for 15% of 1 million jobs, right? But they're responsible for 15% of the cargo, 15% of the pollution, 15% of the health effects, 100% of the 1 million jobs, right? So we want them to take 100% of the responsibility in the Port of Houston to make changes. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has a whole host of recommendations for the Port of Houston Authority that have not been adopted. We want them to follow the TCQ's recommendations and our own recommendations. We heard a lot about diesel trucks. Diesel trucks from years 2010 and newer are 80 to 90% cleaner than diesel trucks from 2007 or before. A diesel engine can last for 1 million miles, 30 years. A diesel truck from 2007 could easily be on the road in 2037, belching out pollution as if it was a truck from 1957. We can't have that. They've already gotten rid of them in Los Angeles. It's still the largest port in the nation. We could do it here too. The Texas Emissions Reduction Plan, 80% of the trucks are owned by individual owners and operators. This is their livelihood. They are reluctant to get rid of their older trucks and buy new ones. The Texas Emissions Reduction Plan will provide them with money to assist in that effort. And of course, we have one healthcare clinic in the area. We need more healthcare clinics. We need them to be funded by local industry. Job training programs, local hiring, traffic management, and reduction. These are our recommendations. They have been done elsewhere. They work. They will not cause the economic hardship that is claimed. It's already been done in LA. We want to see it happen here. That is it. Our organization wants clean air so our economy, our quality of life, and our children can thrive. We want that for the Port of Houston, and we want that for everybody in Houston. Thank you.
Let's go on the other side. We've heard some interesting data and information today, and I just kind of jotted down some of the themes that kind of emerged from all of the presentations. And so we kind of saw that pollution seems to be affecting our EJ communities. Those communities are comprised of people of color. We know that they have a high percent minority. They seem to be faced with illnesses such as asthma and cancer and cardiovascular disease. There was a focus on the expansion of the Panama Canal, both from the residents' perspective in terms of them seeing that as an opportunity, but also from a perspective of our researchers who show it as potentially a problem in terms of increasing pollution in terms of TRI facilities and TRI releases, so releases of more pollution basically. And then these communities seem to be affected by a lack of insurance and access to care, as well as opportunities for employment. And so I just wanted to kind of point out the themes, and we will now ask our panels for questions. We move... Where?
Is there a microphone?
It was here.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm Andrew Dodson with Texas Campaign for the Environment. I want to thank you all so much for the presentation today, which was amazing. I actually learned a lot too. One thing I wanted to note is that, as I understand, when the Port of Long Beach improved their truck standard, all those trucks that were no longer out there, they moved them over here to Houston, and now they're putting them in Houston. So, we're talking about. Something that we've been working a lot on, we work a lot on waste issues. Dr. Bullard, of course, has been a leader on the information around those. And we've been specifically opposing the one bin for all proposal from the city, which would concentrate all the city's waste into a single new facility, which they propose a gasification facility, which is a form of waste incineration, what I call a garbage removal. It's a new refinery for East Houston, but instead of turning petroleum into gas, it's turning garbage into gas. What are your thoughts on this proposal? What should we be doing about this? And what is the future of environmental business?
Well, if you look at Houston and where it ranks in terms of recycling, we're pretty bad. We're pretty lousy. And I think the investments and the leadership that we should be promoting is to really move forward with an aggressive recycling program so that households have opportunities and take responsibility to recycle, and not some unproven fantasy one bin experiment. I think we need to really step up to the plate and do what a lot of other cities have done, is to really go forward with a proven strategy, and that's real recycling.
Yeah, there's an interesting brand, I think, of kind of pessimism and optimism that has led to this one bin program. I think that it shows some pessimism about our ability to increase recycling rates here in Houston. We're at about 17%, and we've fought hard over the last 40 years to get to that 17%. And I think that there's maybe some pessimism about our ability to get any further. And then, as Dr. Bullard said, there's optimism bordering on fantasy in this program. It strings together a series of unproven technologies, and if all of those technologies were to come together and work for the first time in history, right, it would be a fantastic program. But the fact is, at this point, we just don't know. So we're eager to see what happens with this program, and we'll leave it there.
Yes, I would like to know, based upon your research and based upon your work over the years, what have been the most challenging counter arguments for your positions on economic justice and sustainability? And I mean more specifically in terms of ideological and economic arguments, in terms of consumer choice, in terms of productivity, in terms of the free enterprise, things of that sort. Thank you.
I'll just say one thing quickly, which is that we've seen at the Port of Houston, and we see from industry time and again that there are always broad claims of competitive disadvantage, right? Any time that we propose some sort of a new, innovative, or aggressive control, the response is this will put us at a competitive disadvantage. And that's what we heard out of LA and Long Beach. And as I mentioned, that it was proven not to be true. It was, and it still is, the largest port in the nation. And it has done an amazing job of putting in new technologies to reduce pollution. So I think that, history has demonstrated that a lot of these claims of competitive disadvantage are unwarranted.
I guess I just want to add that when the Port of Houston released their economic reports outlining the millions of jobs that they were personally responsible for in the Houston area, we actually contacted the consulting firm that they had contracted with to do that report, because in fact some of the work that we had done was did create jobs at the port, and we didn't feel like they were included in that assessment. And so we just wanted to have a conversation about the data that they had used and what were the inputs and so forth, and were refused a meeting. And so I guess I think as Adrian pointed out earlier, we can't just accept the good and not have any accountability for the bad. And so when we're talking about these numbers around jobs and the economy, first of all, we need to be able to verify those numbers and to have folks feel like there's some transparency that those numbers are real. And then on the second side of that, I think we also need to make sure that if we're going to claim responsibility for jobs and the economic health of the entire region, then we also need to have some accountability for the pollution and the impacts that our operations have on the communities around the port. And I think that is a piece that we have not seen the port take very good leadership on. And so we are all trying to press forward in that way. It is difficult in Houston. It's harder to work with a port in Houston than I think it was in Southern California, because there are 450 other ports in Houston that are not in Southern California. And so that's one of the challenges that we've seen, is that, well, we're not the only players here. And so that's one of the things that we do struggle with.
I think the fact that whether we talk about a port, or whether we talk about a chemical plant, or we talk about any other industry that emits pollution, I think when we calculate the benefits, whether it be jobs, whether it be economic development, we have to also calculate total externalities and calculate the true cost of producing something. And I think largely in our society, we've stopped short of putting all of the factors into the hopper to calculate what the true costs are. And too often we neglect the health impacts and the cost in terms of illnesses and disease and the disparate impact of having something next to you that is creating all kinds of not only physical health problems, but also mental health problems that's intergenerational. You grew up in a neighborhood that's bombarded with all kinds of pollution. Your neighborhood is identified as compatible land used with garbage, and therefore you are garbage. And kids, that gets inculcated into the body politics of leaders who are making decisions, but also young people who are growing up in those environments. And so my advocacy would be, let's put all of the numbers into the hopper and make sure that we are actually measuring all the true costs and the externalities. Pollution is not only costly because a company that produces waste is a wasteful company, and so there are models where you that are around that you are ratcheting down, minimizing the pollution, and in some cases going to another production strategy, and so that those kinds of things need to be considered. And in some cases, there's a blocked mindset, and we don't want to consider those things. And so I think what we have to do in our universities and in working with our communities to get those alternative models on the table for consideration.
Yes, my question to the panel is really a reaction to all of the statistics that I saw concerning poverty in Houston and how it hasn't gotten better, it's actually gotten worse. And so when you're looking at these port cities and all of this money that it's talking about bringing in and jobs, what percentage of those jobs are going to people of color in Houston that may be able to ratchet down some of the poverty numbers? What percentage of DBEs are getting contracts, at these ports? Or do we have any information on how the minority or people of color businesses are benefiting from this enormous growth that they keep talking about as we watch poverty levels continue to rise?
Well, let me just give you a little footnote in terms of what data are not collected after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that, race is a no-no, and the fact that some governmental agencies stopped collecting data and some organizations dismantle their affirmative action set-aside programs and their DBE, women program, disadvantage, and they are now retooled and renamed, so it's hard to even get data to identify if the organization is a minority-owned firm or whatever, and so it's not impossible, but I don't think there's a concerted effort to really track that information and to reach certain goals, not quotas, goals. And so there's been a disincentive. And so I think because of that climate, you can bring all kinds of federal monies being input into generating and supporting an economic engine and not have to account for in any real way where the money is going, where the flow of resources and who's benefiting from it. You can get generic numbers in terms of these are how many jobs are created, but in terms of to what extent are there minority contractors and whether there are whatever groups that are benefiting, that's something that has been lost, and I think a lot of the governmental agencies and entities are reluctant to even collect that data or even have it available so that organizations out there can actually use it and challenge them and grade them on where they are.
I think you bring up a great point. I guess I wanted to make one comment that several years ago the port had issued a public bond to build out some of their Bayport terminal. It was a $250 million bond that the taxpayers paid. And part of what the port said that they were going to use that money for was for environmental projects at the port. Well, when they were questioned directly about what were those specific projects that were a benefit to the environment, the port would not share any of that information. And so one of the things, even under an open records request, and so one of the things that I think we should all do a better job of is holding the port accountable for having to explain how they're spending our money and where it is going and whether these economic benefits that they're reporting are valid and transparent. And I don't think that has happened in the past, and I think that is one thing that we should add to the Ports Coalition effort, is to call for that greater transparency, because the fact is it doesn't do any good for the port to keep saying these things when no one can verify or validate it.
Dr. Fagan has the mic. Okay, hold on.
Yeah, Bob, one of the striking things to me in looking at Houston's history is how much federal money went into building up the petrochemical industry and the Port of Houston. That's the mythology of the free enterprise city. It just doesn't exist, right? The petrochemical industry was built by huge federal subsidies, especially during World War II and after World War II. The Port of Houston has had huge federal subsidies over its lifetime. Is any of that used to argue why not bring in federal aid, the Affordable Care Act, for example, health care clinics, go after federal money to deal with the externalities, which are really internalities, right?
Yeah. Let me just take a stab. Yes, I think, standing up here on the podium and standing as a dean of a policy school, for me, those are questions that are ripe for policy, and working with organizations, advocacy organizations that are out there working on healthcare issues, working on issues that impact communities in terms of resources, in terms of jobs, job training, all those things. And I think that's, for me, would be a very good marriage in terms of creating those partnerships and providing a space for that kind of activity to blossom. You're right. Federal monies were used to create these economic engines, and And so I think that there's a great opportunity for us to really tap into that idea that there's something that needs to be given back, and we need to work on those issues.
Well, along those lines, I'd like to hear more about the local hiring practices program and whether that is something that the coalition is pushing here, and whether you think the political culture would lend itself, because we do know that the political culture in California is a bit different.
Just a bit.
Yeah, just quickly, I would say that one of our recommendations to the Port of Houston Authority is a point system that gives preference for local and veteran hiring.
Can you tell me some details of what that looks like in California? What does that program look like? What kinds of jobs are they getting them, that sort of thing?
I cannot, no, I'm afraid I can't. If I may, I just want to share one thing quickly that goes to the prior question. It's just kind of an anecdote that demonstrates the power of local organizing. There is a government subsidy for pollution control projects that are undertaken at chemical facilities, and Valero, which is the largest independent refiner in the world, attempted to retroactively take advantage of this subsidy to the tune of about $100 million in local taxes that it was going to claw back, much of which would have come from local schools. And there was a very quick and effective organizing effort. Texas Organizing Project was mentioned earlier. They were part of it, Public Citizen, and a number of other organizations in this area. And in a matter of weeks, there was such a public outcry over Valero's attempt to claw back $100 million from local schools that it was soundly defeated.
Hi. I should probably stand. I guess with all this talk about jobs and especially centered on like programs to go against the pollution that's being done in these EJ communities, I have a question about NGOs who come into communities to do surveys and how equitable those jobs are with the people who actually conduct it, and like how funds get dispersed through these NGOs. Just a question, because I work with Tejas, and we are shoestring budget, and so I was just curious how that job creation within those NGOs are equally and equitably distributed as well, because when we go and do research, we do require people to go out and canvass and do these things, but it's hard for us to receive funds for doing that. So I was just wondering about even those jobs that are stimulated by trying to be proactive against, pollution in these communities. Like, how can we work with that? It's also because most of those NGOs aren't people of color NGOs. So that's just another question that I have towards that.
Well, let me be more, I guess, general in terms of what I've learned over the last 3 decades in working from a university standpoint and using the community-based participatory research model and working to using a community empowerment model, so that when we develop research projects and grants that are in support of the work in EJ communities, the EJ communities become an equal partner, and it's built into the grant in terms of resources. And what we tried to do over the years is to really assist communities in getting through that door of foundations so that they can speak for themselves. The first principle of environmental justice is that people must speak for themselves, and so in getting organizations in the room, and once you get them in the room, they can speak for themselves, and trying to change the mindset of foundations and even governmental agencies that some of our community-based organizations can qualify for resources, can handle grants, and can do the kind of work that they've been doing volunteering and for free, that they can actually build their capacity within those to do this kind of work. And this has been a struggle, and it's been a challenge over the years, and Houston is no different. You know, when I left here 25 years ago, this was a problem. When I moved to LA, it was a problem. When I moved to Atlanta, it was a problem in Atlanta. When I moved back to Houston, it's a problem. So this is something we have to work on continuously, 24/7.
You know, I just quickly add to that, you know, NGOs that take the time and invest the resources to do community-based participatory research can expect greater return for their efforts. The last survey that my organization, Airlines Houston, conducted was in Galena Park, Texas, a community with about 8,000 homes. Our response rate for that survey exceeded our expectations. It was over 30%, and the reason for that is that our canvassers were high school students from Galena Park High School, and they were paid for their efforts.
Hi, my name is Tara Escudero. My question is, what is being done in your eyes or by yourselves, or what do you see being done by other people to challenge our fundamental use of fossil fuels as the issue? For an example, the point source pollution sources in the port, such as Valero Refinery, violate the Clean Air Act every day, and there's nothing being done about that. So what truth is being spoken to how our use of fossil fuels is inherently destructive?
You know, Dr. Bullard mentioned earlier internalizing the costs of fossil fuel use, and you know, unfortunately, a lot of the ways that that's done these days is through you know, litigation and legal wrangling. You know, make it more expensive to build a coal plant by suing everyone involved, and that's unfortunately not the best way to do it, but it is one way. Yeah.
Well, I just add that in our recognition program for ports that are doing good things, like using shore power, for instance, one of the things that we're trying to demonstrate is that if you continue to use fossil fuels, if you continue to use these fuels that are not renewable, that at some point will not be here anymore, then you, by definition, are not running a sustainable operation. And so one of the things that we're trying to advocate for is this transition to becoming truly sustainable. And there are economic opportunities for ports that are looking to the future. For instance, if you were to sell a ship solar power when they come to your port and they plug in, that's a revenue generating opportunity for you. And so instead of burning that dirty bunker fuel, the ship is actually purchasing power from you. And so trying to highlight those kinds of visionary moves that we see at some ports. We're seeing some ports put in wind power. We're seeing ports put in solar power. Why not highlight those and show those as huge success stories? And so that's, I guess, one of the strategies that we feel like is important, because we want to make sure that that we're not just getting stuck in this. We have to have fossil fuels. We're always going to have fossil fuels, and we can't live without fossil fuels. That's not what is truly sustainable. So I think that was a good question.
Yeah. I think also that we also have to really take it home. You know, we're a university of about 10,000 students, and we want our students to understand the issue of what's driving force behind global warming and climate change, and the fact that there has to be a transition period, and we're talking about just transition. We want to get our students in our campus ready for that transition. And so the fact that we're in a building, a School of Public Affairs, we're working, you know, hard to try to get, you know, either solar panels or wind established on this campus, and to have this building be the first building that we move forward in getting that done. Renewables, we want to, you know, walk the talk and walk the talk and walk the walk. We want to make it an example. And so I think we have to, you know, most of our students on this campus are students of color, and some of them are environmentalists and some of them are not, don't see themselves as environmentalists, but I think the fact is that we want to really position ourselves to lead in some of these areas, and the only way we can do that is to get our students involved, get our faculty involved, and just roll up our sleeves and work.
I just want to go back to the title of the conference, Invisible Houston. I think these environmental impacts, health impacts, social impacts, they really are invisible in our community. There's a huge amount of data. Most of it's contained in the private laboratories of individual researchers. It's not in a form that a normal person either has access to or can understand. I think a lot of good work could be done to put the information in forms that are understandable and get it out there. The public interface is lacking in Houston.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we have a project with the USCAN and with the Kellogg Foundation. It's a translational research project. It's actually gathering all the data on certain issues like climate change, like energy, renewable energy, etc., and then putting it into a format that's easy, digestible, and using the different markets, the different media, using social media, but also using radio, using television, using community-based organizations to educate and inform. And that project is one of the projects. It moves from Texas all the way across the Gulf Coast and up the mid-Atlantic, where HBCUs are located and the communities where they are located working in a partnership. That's our Climate Education Community University Partnership, CCUP. And that's an initiative that we have started, and it's a planning grant to work on these issues and inform the population. And once people have the information, people are intelligent enough to say, we're going to make the right decision. This is in our own best interest, and we can't say, they can't say that we didn't know. And so that's one of our projects.
This is an area where the universities and the NGOs could partner more effectively, come together as a community.
Yes.
There's another invisible part of this puzzle, and that is there is a Port of Houston Authority, and that's an appointed body. And it's been in the hands of good old boys for forever. So the question is, really, this is the infrastructure of power. To what extent, we've talked about what ought to be done, but there's the part of how it stays the way it is, the decisions that are made that keeps it in place, and there's no responsibility for these social and environmental and kind of consequences. Have you thought about or begun to work on trying to pressure or what I would call choke points where the decisions are made, the Port of Houston being a very specific body?
Yeah, there's 7 commissioners on the Port of Houston Authority, and I mentioned earlier the Port of Houston sunset legislation, which enacted a suite of ethics reforms at the commission and term limits for the first time on commissioners, and 4 of the 7 commissioners immediately termed out. They have all been replaced. Our organization, the Healthy Port Communities Coalition, and a number of other organizations lobbied throughout the sunset process for increased citizen representation on the commission, up to including the creation of a new position on the commission to represent the interests of communities. We were told at that time by the state legislature that our voice was not properly brought to the state, but rather should be brought to the individual commissions themselves. So there was no additional seat added. We began to lobby at the individual positions. Of the 7 positions, 2 of them belong to the city of Houston, 2 of them belong to the county, 1 of them the city of Pasadena, 1 of them a cabal of individuals known as the Harris County Mayors and Councils Association, and then the chair is a joint appointment from the city and the county. We fairly quickly zeroed in on the city of Pasadena chair as the position that we would lobby against. We found an individual who we advocated for, and I mean, in short, the efforts were not successful. That individual was, strung along by the mayor and the city council, and ultimately somebody else was chosen for that position. There has been created a Chairman's Citizens Advisory Council. The new chairman of the port, Janice Longoria, created a council to advise her. One of those seats belongs to our organization. A number of the positions on that seat were given to people that we recommended, But another one of those positions is one of the former commissioners who just termed out under the new sunset legislation. So it awaits to be seen what will happen with that council, but at least on that front, we're optimistic that there will be some changes made.
We are approaching lunchtime, so we only have time for one more question. Sorry.
My question is concerning we as a concerned body. What would be the most effective avenue or channel in which we can affect or drive these entities toward compliance or accountability? What is it, the local advocate groups or what? What would you recommend?
Well, I would just say, yes, start with the local groups. Contact Adrian, contact myself. We can get you tied into some of the local efforts that we're pursuing. I think also telling your story to EPA, letting them know that this is an important issue, that the communities around these ports are at increased risk and that something has to be done. And so to raise awareness on every front. I think that's one of the things that has been an issue in Houston, and California did a much better job of the community organizing portion of their advocacy. They got a lot of people together, and we have just started those efforts in Houston, but I think that needs to grow and needs to become a more powerful force.
Yeah, I think there's no substitute for organizing and coalition building and having a diversity of entities at the table: universities, organizations, churches, civic clubs, neighborhood associations, all kinds of groups who identify this as their issue and own the issue and drive the issue. And I think they can create. Even though there's no cookie cutter method for this, there's no by the numbers. I know Texas is not California. When I left Houston, I went to LA, and so having multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial organizations that are coming together with a unified goal of making change and reducing the kinds of emissions and making a healthy community. Those are things I think we can organize around, but it's going to take resources and it's going to take a will and a commitment. I think Houston is ready for something like that. We already have the seeds of that, and so we need to build on it and expand it.
They were laying down in the streets in LA.
Thank you to the panelists for another enlightening panel discussion. I just wanted to end with a kind of a take-home from Dr. Kraft's story that she told us. We must not accept societal norms as our norms. Join us for lunch. We'll be crossing over to the Childhood Development Building. Thank you.
Oh. Okay. I thought you had a question. You said go with it.
Oh. I'm sorry.